Okay, so today we are going to go over the three of the leather hard slip application methods. So we have sgraffito, which is where you paint slip on and then you carve through to reveal the lighter line work. We have mishima, which is kind of the opposite, where you carve in and then you inlay a colored slip and remove any of the excess. And paper resist, which is generally a painting technique, but you could also use it with dipping. So first we'll start with paper resist. As you recall from the presentation in class, or the demonstration in class, if you're doing something vertical, especially on a very symmetrical cylinder that's got straight walls, you can get some pretty straight lines. Anytime that you're dealing with curves, in your contour, utilizing this technique might require you to do it in bits and pieces so that you can get around those curves and get the kinds of lines that you want. But just a quick refresher. When you're using the paper as a resist, you need to dampen the paper, not saturate, just a little bit of water on your sponge, and go ahead and lay the paper down. If it doesn't stick immediately, you will need to kind of press it a little bit, but if it doesn't stick immediately, you can use that damp sponge to kind of press and get that edge to lay down and stick to the vessel. If it doesn't have a good contact there, the slip will get underneath your paper and you'll end up not getting the line that you want. And you kind of have to work quickly because that water on the paper will dry very quickly. So remember that I want you to use your cylinders to practice these techniques. And I want you to practice all of the leather hard techniques. Most of them require the clay to be at regular leather hard. And all of the techniques that I'm showing in this video require leather hard clay. Okay? If you really want to be sure that that paper isn't going to move anywhere, find your metal rib, wherever you might have left it, underneath the bucket. Find your wooden rib, works too, and just kind of buff it. And simply take your paintbrush Again, you can do this either by painting or by dipping. Okay, remember that if you dip your slip, you're going to end up with a more consistent application. If you brush it on and only do one coat, you might end up seeing those brush strokes. That's not a bad thing, it's just a choice. So I want mine to be a little bit more opaque. You want to wait until it's not shiny anymore, so it's still pretty shiny on there before you go ahead and peel off. You can expedite this by blowing on it, but don't use a heat gun. So it's starting to not be so shiny right here in the middle where it's touching the clay. It might stay shiny on the paper. And at that point you peel it off. And then you've got this really crisp line. Remember that one of the benefits of slip as a design material is that it doesn't move like a glaze does, right? A glaze will kind of feather, and you would never be able to get this kind of intricate design by using a glaze. Okay, so Now I want to show you some sgraffito. Where you paint on, oops, probably out of the frame there, sorry about that. Paint on, or dip. You can dip your slip to do this. It all depends on what kind of composition you're trying to create. Again, if you brush it on, you will probably see brush strokes. Also remember that if you use slip and you want it to be shiny, you need to use Japanese transparent as a glaze over it. Otherwise, it will be as matte as your clay is when it's fired and unglazed. Okay, so just like with this, you want to wait until that slip that you've applied is no longer shiny. It kind of has a tacky look to it, satin. And you take your pen tool, again, hold it like a pencil. If you drag it like this perpendicular to the surface, you'll get a lot of what we call burrs. If you can hold it like this, you're kind of compressing the clay down as you create your line, and you won't create as many burrs. Do clean off your tool as you go. And you can think about breaking your picture plane, right? If you have like a frame that you've made with your color, you don't have to stay in it. So this is a very random design and frankly does not complement anything else on the vessel, but I'm just showing you the technique, okay? So as you are using your cylinders for these techniques, just explore, just utilize it as a way to understand the benefits and maybe the drawbacks of the various techniques that you have available to you. The last technique that I want to show you is Mishima. So that's this one, that's like the inlay. And that is where you create the design first. Again, this is going to be pretty random compared to everything else that's on there. Incise first. And then what you do is you'll take your paintbrush and you're going to be inlaying the slip. It doesn't really matter if it goes outside of that line because you're going to go back with your metal rib and scrape that extra material off. One thing to pay attention to is how deep you've carved your line. If you've carved a pretty deep line, which I have, it may take several applications of slip to actually have the slip rise up to be the same level as the wall. So you don't have to have it be the same level. It could be inlaid and recessed. Again, it's a choice. So it's entirely up to you and your composition if you want your surface to be entirely level and you want to literally fill the void with slip and bring that up to the surface of the clay, or if you just want to have the color in there and you don't mind if it's recessed a bit. I found that ideally it's best to wait until the piece becomes closer to bone dry before you use your metal rib rather than simply waiting until the slip is dry in there. Because if the clay is still leather hard, as you're using your rib, you can end up smushing the lines down. Okay. So this slip was kind of thick, and that's why I ended up, I didn't just stain the lines, right? I end up kind of painting the whole thing. Here is a different design with a slip that is a little bit thinner that just kind of flowed right into the line. So I don't have as much cleanup here as I did before. All right, I gotta find that tool that I lost now. There it is. So again, in an ideal world, you would want to wait until this is closer to a stiff leather hard or even almost bone dry. But you want to take your metal rib and just start to take off that excess material. So what you can see, because I didn't wait, you can see how that extra material ended up kind of caving back and filling in that hole. You might be able to use your pin tool and open that back up slightly, but you also risk moving or removing some of that inlay material. So I'm going to get a heat gun and dry it a little bit more, and then show you the difference between removing it when it's kind of soft versus a little bit stiffer. Okay, so as you use the heat gun, this gets extremely hot and you never want to touch that metal part. You also never want to rest it on one of the splash pans, because you remember I showed you in class what that does to the splash pan. It totally melts it. This gets extremely hot, but it's extremely effective. What you don't want to do is you don't want to hold it way up close, because then you might really compromise the clay wall, right? It gets too hot too quick. And it's got two settings. So if you're using the heat gun, you just want to be kind of moving it back and forth, circular. It's kind of like if you're blow drying your hair, but don't ever use this to blow dry your hair because you will burn your hair. We also do have a regular hair dryer if you're a little bit nervous about using the heat gun. So a hair dryer will work also, it will just take a little bit longer. So you can see that the slip is beginning to change color, right? It's becoming lighter. So that means that it's drier right there, okay? So that's kind of what you want to see before you go ahead and start using your metal rib on your machine. There's also another way you can do Mishima that I always forget that is far less risky, so we'll go over that also. Okay, so now when I take my rib, it should kind of just take it away, but not squish that line as much, right? So this was the line that I did before, and you can see how it kind of got squished in. This is the line that I'm doing now, and it just retains its shape, because the clay is stiffer and it's not getting mushed in on itself. So this just, you just kind of keep working at it until you've gotten all the extra slip off of your vessel, and there you've got your design. Now, because you have the opportunity to utilize your cylinders and not be worried about a grade on them, think about how you might combine some of these techniques within one design, right? So I could now maybe, maybe I would paint some slip over here and then sgraffito a design to complement this and give it a more defined kind of frame. So it doesn't have to be a one and done where you use one technique and that's it. The best ceramics are layered. Their designs are layered. So you will end up, even if you wait, you'll end up with some of that clay kind of getting in there. But don't worry about that until after it's bisked, because at that point you can go ahead and stick your pin tool in there and kind of open it back up, and you won't lose the blue or the slip that's the colored slip that's on the inside. And it can be kind of hard to see right now, but when this gets fired, you'll really see how crisp that design is. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the other way of Mishima that isn't so risky. Okay, so the less risky way of doing Mishima is to paint. Let's see, where do I have a blank canvas? I guess I'm going to go right here. Anywhere where you want to do that Mishima, go ahead and paint with wax resist. Now, if I wanted to have done this design, I would have painted this whole area with wax and filled the whole thing in, okay? But because I forgot about this technique and I'm backpedaling, I'm just gonna do this teeny tiny little area here. Oh gosh, am I in front here? Mm-hmm. Okay, remember to clean your brushes with Shout after you use the wax, because it leaves that residue. We do have to wait for this to dry before you start. Sometimes the heat gun works with wax and sometimes it's completely counterproductive because it's wax. What happens with wax with heat? It can just melt. So if you do too close, it won't dry. You know your wax is drying when it's not this light green color anymore. When it starts to become a little bit more of a dark green and not as opaque looking. The other thing to remember about Mishima is that the width of the line is usually not going to end up being the width of the line that you initially carved. It'll be a little bit thinner. But you could try using some of the ball styluses in the hand building classroom instead of your pin tool. And as long as those lines are deep enough, you may be able to achieve, wider lines with those. Okay. And remember, what we know about wax is that it will resist anything from absorbing into a surface that has wax applied to it. So the concept here is that I'm not actually going to have to use my rib. I'm just going to use my sponge and wipe the excess away. I will end up having burrs that I'm going to need to sand off, but you don't want to do that until after it's been bisque fired. Oops. So again, your wax has to be dry for this to be effective. Take your sponge wring it out, and just kind of dab that surface. Don't rub it. And there you've got the colored slip inlaid without the risk of mushing that line and ultimately kind of caving it in. If you want a really thin line, you might have to do it this way. If you're okay with a thicker line, then you can do it this way. Again, all of these little burrs will end up going away, but only after you biscuit, and then go ahead and use sandpaper with your mask, and you need to do that either outside or in front of the spray booth. The end.